for coming. We're excited to have with us tonight Frank Mauceri, Renaissance man. Frank is an artist, a composer, a saxophonist, and educator who's been teaching music and new media in the music department of Bowdoin College for the past 20 years. His work ranges from digital prints like we have in the paperwork show that Bruce Brown here curated, to animations, to interactive musical performances. His print work explores generative systems, often informed by musical processes. His solo performances and his collaborations with dancers, singers, instrumentalists, and video artists experiment with digital signal processing and sensor technologies as an extension of the expressive body. Frank studied music composition and art theory at Oberlin College and earned a D.M.A. from the University of Illinois. With that, turn it over to Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to thank John and all the folks at Cove Street for inviting me. And I want to thank Bruce Brown, who curated this wonderful show, Paperwork. And I feel fortunate to be in the company of work by Karen Adrian, Kathleen Florence, Munira Naki. This is a nice moment to celebrate that. Thank you also, John, for that introduction. And as another way of providing a short introduction, I'm going to play a small video of a work called Flying Square that touches on a lot of the aesthetic concerns that I have. And just a moment here while I load it up. Even though I do music technology, I hate PowerPoint, so you are not going to get a PowerPoint presentation. Excuse me, I'm going to stop it here. But that's an excerpt of a longer work. As John said, my background is primarily in music. I'm a saxophonist from childhood and trained in school as a composer. And my current work in media and visual work grew out of my work in music and in teaching music. I was teaching computer music, and I decided I wanted to draw in some students from outside their interest in music, and I taught a course on interactive theory. By the way, if at any point I'm too soft, please speak up and let me speak a little bit louder. And in developing course materials for this course in interactive media, I became so intrigued by these processes that it grew into a practice that consumes me to this day, of producing work that isn't just musical. And in this video that I just opened with, you can see that I'm interested in formal processes and generative processes, and in particular, I'm interested in processes that organize materials at all different architectural scales, so that the local elements, both in space and time, are generated by the same processes that are generating the large-scale architecture of the piece. So this kind of integration across scales of experience, and that's one of the things that really fascinates me. The other thing is processes that are rich enough and complex enough in their behavior that I can't really predict what the process is going to produce. So it doesn't interest me so much to envision a certain outcome, to imagine a certain pattern or picture or sound, and then to make the machine that produces that thing that I've already imagined. I'm much more interested in finding a process that has a kind of rich potential for discovery and that can surprise me. So that's the theme that I want to explore tonight as I share a number of different processes with you that I've used. Many of the pieces in the show you'll recognize when I start talking about these processes. The first process I want to show you is a system that I called Snarl that I developed about 3 years ago. And let me bring up a little demo that I have of this. Hold on a second here. Snarl is a computer program that I wrote that simulates an articulated arm moving in three-dimensional space. The angle and the movements of each segment of the limb are controlled by periodic waveforms, the kind of waveforms that I would use to synthesize music, sine waves or triangle waves. So for every articulation, for every joint, I actually need two waveforms. And by the way, this is a three-dimensional system, so you can see that the arm is moving in three-dimensional space. Let me pause it for a second. So for every articulation, I actually need two different waveforms to define the movement in two different planes, right? In the XY plane and the YZ plane, so that I can get a location in three-dimensional space. So I mean, this all sounds a little bit mathematical, but in fact, I think of it very musically, because if I have two different wave functions, they have a kind of musical relationship to each other. The two waveforms have a frequency, and these frequencies can be related to each other like two pitches of musical notes, right? So if the frequencies are in a ratio of 2 to 1, if one's twice as fast as the other, it's like an octave. You know, if they're in a 2 to 3 relationship, it's like a perfect fifth, like the difference between C and G. So, for every articulation, I need 2 waveforms, and so there's a kind of chord that's being visualized with a system like this, and I can make some predictions about what the figure is going to look like based on my knowledge of these relationships of harmonic waveforms. So if these harmonic relationships are very simple, like the octave or the perfect fifth, then the arm's going to return on the same path in short order, and it'll start retracing the same path. If the frequencies are slightly out of tune, and any of you who've played a musical instrument have tried to tune, if you're slightly out of tune, you get a kind of beating pulsation. And visually, that we kind of see the path of the arm returns on itself, but slightly off, slightly precessed. And so we get striations, like a spirograph kind of striation. So when you see that in the work, that's a kind of out of tuneness. If the harmonic relationships are very unrelated to each other, then we end up with very knotted and complex figures. So let me let this develop a little bit more, and you can start seeing how patterns start emerging in the three-dimensional space. So I have a lot of different initial conditions when I set up a system like this. One is the length of each segment in the limb. The other is the frequencies that I'm using to move each segment of the limb. And these parameters can be modulated by other periodic functions. So for example, if the movement of the arm is slightly wiggled, like a vibrato or a tremolo, that's a kind of modulation of the range of motion. The other thing that I can change is the sampling rate or the frame rate of the system. So here I've slowed down the frame rate quite a bit so that when I connect the location of the arm from its previous location, I connect it with a straight line. The computer never really draws a smooth curve. The computer always draws straight lines. It's just if the straight lines are small enough, it looks like a curve. So, so one of the creative parameters I have is this sampling rate, and the smoothness or the straightness of the figure is something I can control and I can modulate over time. Yep. Let me close this. Here are some still images. So in order to get still images, I fly a virtual camera around these three-dimensional models and take pictures. Usually I have some kind of algorithm for doing that as well, because I'm reluctant to just make the choice myself. The geometries of these figures are so rich and interesting that if I simply choose things that look good to me, I'm liable to just choose patterns that I've seen before, that are familiar or that I like. So I'm highly suspicious of my own preferences, and so I usually take a large body of images randomly at different distances and from different angles. This is a series called Flourish. By the way, these are the same object, just from different angles. And this series uses pretty simple harmonic relationships. You can see the path is returned on itself. This is a different series called Scaffold, and this also has pretty simple harmonic relationships, but I've modulated the sampling rate, so there's this counterpoint between the smooth and the straight.
I have a question. What about the thickness, like the thickness of the lines and then the thin ones?
The thickness of the line is a result of the path returning on itself and retracing the path. And there are slight inconsistencies built in the program, so it doesn't come exactly to the same location, so that we get a little bit of thickness and weight. This object is from a series called Synapse, and we have two examples in the show. But in the show I have details of the object, so you never see the entire object. It's called Synapse because of this lovely moment where something almost touches and doesn't quite touch, this connection. And here are some details. This is one of the pieces in the show, but rotated.
Is this one of those things out of tune, or?
Yeah, so like these kind of striations are the result of a kind of out of tuneness. Yeah. This is a series called Hank, and it's all the lines are straight lines, partly because of the sampling rate and partly because I'm modulating the path with a random offset, so the arm's kind of jittery. This is a different series called Hydrozoa. They reminded me of sea creatures. This is a series called, I'm forgetting the name, Halter, I think. Another one. So with each thing that I'm calling a series, it's one object with many different views. Another way I vary this system is that I translate the whole arm. In this case, I'm translating the arm across a two-dimensional space, so the entire arm is moving back and forth. And so I have a number of series where I'm interested in this kind of space-filling strategy, where the arm is drawing and trying to fill up a square virtual canvas. In this series, what I've done is I've attached a virtual spring between limbs, so there's a kind of feedback mechanism. When the arm moves, then there's a kind of force that wants to return. So certain kinds of chaotic oscillations happen in addition to the ones imposed by the original wave functions. Most of my work is in black and white, but I've made some experiments in color in this series called Soshu, which is kind of in honor of the tradition of Japanese calligraphy. I've inserted two-dimensional geometric primitive, these long red rectangles, into the three-dimensional space. So now the black figure kind of wraps itself around the two-dimensional vertical. This is another series that deals with color. It's called Balanced Action. And in these experiments with color, I'm extracting the color palette from a photograph. So this is a photograph of my saxophone. So my saxophone did make it into the lecture. I want to talk about a different series, a different system altogether. This system is called Dream Maps, and Dream Maps is a system for distorting two-dimensional grids, sometimes with gradient noise, and sometimes with modulation using periodic functions like sine functions. I was originally inspired by a show I saw of Aboriginal paintings, and these used repeated dot and line patterns to describe a topology. And in that tradition, usually that topology or that map concerned stories that were embedded in the community and stories that came out of dreams. So I was interested in this idea of a map, of a kind of topographical map, and different ways I could generate mapping. So what the program does is it plots like a Cartesian grid of vertices, and the vertices can be connected with lines in various ways. But the position of the vertices starts out as like a very regular grid, and then I displace each of them using some kind of random function. And usually this is what I called gradient noise, a kind of smoothed random function, random numbers that have been interpolated so that there's a kind of smooth relationship between them. And so these kind of smooth bumps and patterns are randomly generated, but have this smooth feature and feel like a kind of surface. And here's the same idea, just expressed very differently. I have a large series that just is concerned with very subtle distortions of the grid to create these moire patterns. Another thing that I do is that these distortions of the grid, these modulations, usually when I'm working on them, they're in motion because I'm using oscillators to modulate the positions. So in this one, what I've done is superimposed a lot of different versions that are as it's in motion. I just kept taking pictures over and over again and superimposing them. I can actually show you that. So kind of here's where this starts. The line is very light, but you can imagine this is kind of dancing around, and I keep superimposing versions of it in motion. And over time, it builds up densities that reflect the motion. So this is a way that I frequently work in that even things that I intend to be still images, they're animated as I'm working with them. And this idea of sort of capturing that time element in the still image is, that's a project that engages me in a lot of these different series. This is a very different series called Babel. The Babel series comes out of a longer project called Automatic Writing, and I'm interested in the visual impact of typography and calligraphy, the appearance of script, and this specific series, Babel series, was inspired by a short story by the Argentinian writer Borges. And the story is entitled The Library of Babel. In that story, Borges posits a universe made up of endless shelves of books, and the universe contains every possible random variation of letter sequences. So in fact, the universe contains every book that was ever written and every possible book, including all the random nonsense that's possible. And following Borges' description, I created, first I created random texts following his prescription of an alphabet of 25 different characters and 40 lines per page and 80 characters per line and so on and so forth. But I went a step further and decided that each page was going to have a unique alphabet, and the alphabets are randomly generated. This page here, I actually mapped an alphabet onto Borges' text, so this is actually the Borges short story with one of my randomly generated alphabets. This is a detail. Another detail. But these are some of the pages, what they look like, and there are 4 examples in the paperwork show. So I very much recommend the Borges story, which follows all the philosophical possibilities of the fact that we can find meaning in random things, that that language has all this potential for storytelling, that we read our futures and our society into language and all sorts of other possibilities too. So, yes.
Is it a 26 character alphabet, or how are you generating it?
It is a 26, I think I use 25 characters, and then I have a couple of characters for punctuation, and there's a space element as well. But yeah.
And is it just translating text, basically?
It's a random text. So it's not translating any particular text. It's a random arrangement of letters, just like a book that you would pick off the shelf in Borges' library.
It's like tiling. Do you know what I mean by tiling? Like, I don't remember the name of this mathematician that invented a form of order, a form of spacing objects and things like letters, where it was impossible to find any sense of order, which is what as human beings we want to do. Who is that? That mathematician, I can't remember his name.
Oh, there's...
It's like he was famous for this.
Well, Penrose has these tilings that are very interesting and sometimes not, have interesting symmetries to them.
Random to the point where there was no way to find an order in anything. And so I do know a photographer that actually would place this tile over his images and place people and stuff that way. And I was wondering if there was is this totally, you're not in control at all of how these come out? Do they?
So I can stipulate the elements of the typography, like the letter is going to be made of 5 strokes, and 3 of the strokes are going to be connected. And the strokes are going to be thin lines, or they're going to be extruded ribbons like calligraphy. And things.
Into the program.
So I have a lot of parameters to create variety, basically, but each of these pages, they're the same number of lines per page, the same number of letters per line. I'm only using 25 different characters. The alphabet is an alphabet of 25. Sometimes the font size changes so that the letters overlap each other, so I get different kinds of densities that happen, so it becomes unreadable. Yeah, thanks. Were there other questions? Yeah, Bridget.
I have maybe a 2-part question, and pardon me if I stumble through it because I'm still kind of grasping. But so I'm curious about how you think about scale in your work, because in the digital realm, it can be as large or as small as the delivery system.
Yes, that's right.
Right? And then I'm really curious about the impulse to have, text pieces actually give me a window into this, because I've been curious about the drawing-like productions in the output, right?
Yeah.
So there's like an analog reference that you're giving us to this digital realm. And can you talk
No, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that is an important element of my work, and I try to scale things. So first of all, to address the concern that I brought up earlier, that I want the fact that local things and global things are related to each other by similar processes. And so if the scale's wrong, we have no opportunity to notice that. So that's one concern. But the other concern is that there's a tradition of mark making with the body. And when you do something that looks like a drawing or looks like a linotype, then it engages with that tradition. And I'm interested in that ambiguity between marks that could be made by a body and marks that can't be made by a body. And the fact that we can look at the work and at certain distances, it could fool us into thinking, oh, that's charcoal, or that's an engraving, or that's a mark that was made by a hand. And if I get closer, I can see, oh no, that's a computer thing. Or that dialogue is very interesting to me. I don't want it to just refuse the the embodied element. And I don't want it to just dismiss the tradition of mark making with the hand. I really want to engage that tradition. So yeah, thanks. Anthony.
Back to music. You said that, first of all, the ones that you showed earlier were simple, perfect fifth, octave, and then you said when it was out of tune, it made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Would it make a difference if you used like a flat fifth or a ninth or something like that as your interval?
It would make a difference over against the root, right? So it's always the relationships of all the notes that are present, right? So you know, sometimes in a musical context, even if the root or the tonic isn't being sounded, we kind of know from the context that that's there, and the flat fifth means something to us because we kind of remember what we're talking about. So that's not really possible in this. I really need to see the relationship between two frequencies and to measure that relationship in a pattern of motion. Yeah. Yes?
So in the first pieces that you showed us, there was the mathematics in terms of the arm and how that's driven. And then in these unique alphabets that you're showing us, how do you go about generating each of the characters?
Uh-huh.
Do you create that in your mind, or is that something that gets created from a mathematical?
That's also created from an algorithm. So in the initial conditions, I set up, like, I want the letters to have 5 strokes, and 3 of the strokes are going to be connected, and 2 of the strokes are going to be separate, and they'll have a certain thickness, and they'll be so long, it'll have a kind of density to it. And then, and I create that object, and then usually that object's complex enough that I can do 25 random rotations of that object. That object's a 3-dimensional object, by the way, so I'm creating a 3-dimensional letter, and then I do 25 rotations of it, and usually those are distinct enough that it appears like an alphabet, and of course they're all part of the same family. They work together because they have the same DNA.
So it's still created from the stroke, the arm stroke?
It's not an actual arm. I plot random points in space, and I connect those points, usually either with a straight arm or with a Bezier curve or something like that. And that I can also stipulate. Is it connected by a straight arm? Is it connected by some kind of a parabolic function or what, you know, yeah. Yeah.
So the alphabet pictures, if you have how many characters per line, so many lines, so many characters, presumably the computer knows when it's finished. Right?
Knows?
One knows when it's finished.
Yes.
But in the other one, where it's endlessly iterative and active, then
Yes.
you have to decide this is finished or
That's right.
is not finished. So I'm just interested in, I'm always interested in the point at which you make an aesthetic judgment. So the aesthetic judgment you make with this is, I mean, I think it's not quite fair to say that you exert no aesthetic judgment. You make choices about what the characters are going to be like.
Yeah.
3D strokes, whatever. And in the other ones, you're making choices about when it's finished.
Yeah. Yes. So In the snarl system, the arm drawing, a lot of times I stop it, I take a bunch of images, and then I start it up again, and come back or watch it for a long time, and then stop it, and go through this process. So some of these images are drawn in 3 minutes, some of them are drawn in 20 hours. So yeah, and sometimes I've taken hundreds of images at several points along the way, especially if it's over 20 hours. I've probably stopped it every few hours, taken lots of images. And at some point it stops being more interesting. You know, it kind of reaches some kind of point where the added complexity is not adding any information. So that's usually the point where I stop. And then I have to exert my preferences and make judgments about which images I want to keep and which I want to throw away. And usually they have something to do with the richness of my experience viewing them. The images that I keep returning to that I can't quite figure out are the ones that I value the most. Yeah.
So this is this a combination of almost like there's a timeline down, if you were going to look at this on a screen, so there's a timeline like when you're making a video? Mm-hmm. Is there a timeline? Where you see like all the images are changing and then can you edit it that way as you would?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really go back in time.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, if I wanted to and I reconstructed the program in such a way, then I could go back in time, but I haven't made it that way.
Record the process
Yeah.
of the video.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just trying to question my own assumptions because now I'm believing that it's an arm drawing line. So now I'm curious about, is there any possibility of programming the space around it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I could, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I mean, the space around it could be distorting what it does. The space around it could be like drawing in water that things move around, or there could be gravitational fields, or the space around it. I mean, I've had systems where I have two arms and they're playing cat's cradle, they're drawing to each other.
The question came from in constructing a text block, you have to program the negative spaces between the text. Right?
Uh-huh.
So I'm curious about, I'm just curious if that's part of the process of designing an assertion, is that you're also thinking about the non-assertion.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice way of putting it. I mean, I mean, even just in laying out a text, I have all the normal typographical considerations of spacing, right? If the grid were bigger, there would be space in between each one of these characters, and the feeling would be totally different. And yeah, and the impact of spaces where there were spaces between words would be very different as well. So for this series, I decided that I was going to use this folio format that you see displayed out there, that particular A2 size, and that was going to be a page. And then I decided what the proportions were, the margins that would be typical for a folio book like that, and the kind of density, and then I could have a variety of densities. I could choose the font sizes. So if we go through some of these, you'll see some of them, the fonts really overlap, very curly. Some of them, we see space and we see the lines, right? So there's a lot of different feelings and textures that can emerge from this idea of a text. This was from the original exhibition of this piece. In the Borges story, a book contains 410 pages. So that's kind of my goal for the series, is to have 410 unique pages of text. So I, of course, brought way too much stuff to show you. Instead of showing you another few series of works, I'm just going to again play a video for you, different video, and this video comes out of this dream maps system, this idea of mapping a grid of vertices. In this case, I've taken that grid and I've wrapped it around a cube shape, and then I'm using wave functions to distort the vertices in the map, but also to distort the shape of the cube. So the animation is real time, and there's some music to go along with it as well. This is called Prelude number 1. Hold on a second, I'll find it for you.
Do you write this music?
Yes. Okay. I'm going to play a 3-minute excerpt from this piece. And before I do, I'm just going to read a short bit from my, a short paragraph from my artist statement. Artists are asked all the time to make statements. It's like we're asked for a manifesto. So damn it, I'm going to read mine. So, I notice myself living within systems that I find undesirable. And so, the need for designing systems, analogies to the systems we desire. I want human-made systems rather than system-made humans. I am not so concerned with producing images or sounds that I like. I'm not so concerned with producing images or sounds that I like. My preferences are conditioned by systems already in place. Rather than make the patterns that I want, patterns emerge from the systems I want. Oh, and let's do that again. Thank you.
So are you writing music after you study the movement? Are you writing to the movement?
So, yes, I am. And usually I'm employing some control processes that are very similar to the ones that I use in the visuals.
So they can anchor themselves to some of the gesture that you create?
Yeah. So there isn't a one-to-one correspondence.
Okay.
And I'm interested in exploring that possibility.
Could you take your music, compose your music, and put it into your system, and then create from just the sound, just the music?
So I would have to make a different system than the one I'm using now to do that. And that's an interesting project for me. I'm actually interested in doing something like that.
I would love to see this with the sound of wind.
Uh-huh.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Because it takes on an organic aspect.
Yep.
The other part of my question for you in particular, you seem to be very entertained, and all artists need to be self-entertained about movement and animation. Why were you compelled to grab still frames?
Yeah, good question. I think part of it is that the still frames are a kind of abstraction of the movement, and by abstraction I mean it's already a kind of analysis to freeze the thing. Like we discover a different aspect of the thing by freezing it. You know, just like we learn so much about our lived experience by looking at a photograph, and the photograph's nothing like the movement of phenomenology of walking through the world. But the photograph, the abstraction of freezing that moment allows us to discover things we wouldn't otherwise discover. And the same with taking these stills of these animated processes. So that's one answer. And the other answer goes back to Bridget's point that this engages with a tradition of mark making. The still image engages with an image of a tradition of mark making that it wouldn't if I kept it in as a video.
I get a strong sense in the brief time that we've gotten to know you in what you're saying is that even when you're looking at one of your own created still images, you can still see the movement that it took to get to that spot. It's like still moving.
Well, I know what I mean. I have a memory of it, and I also have just a familiarity with the language of the system. You know, what kind of movements are possible. But at the same time, like I see two images of the same three-dimensional object, and I'm amazed that they're the same object. And yeah, that's a wonderful experience for me. Like
we should look at three-dimensional objects like that all the time.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating watching those three-dimensional objects move, which is the way you describe it, and that's a rather Ptolemaic way of viewing it. And I think the frame reinforces that. It's really hard not to see that the object is moving, but I wonder if there's a Copernican way where we see ourselves moving a fixed object, and if there would be some way to project that would help us see.
Well, like in this last video, do you notice that your proximity to the object is changing?
Well, my proximity to certain parts of it, I think. It feels as if, certain parts are swinging around close.
Okay. So, yeah, if you watch the whole, 15 minutes, the object's out and you zoom inside of the object and then you zoom out again. So over the entire experience, you would actually see some of that difference. I change that slowly enough that you don't notice.
Right.
You don't think of yourself as moving.
You see it as coming towards you,
Ah,
and you're fixed.
that's a,
Coming
yeah.
towards you or moving away.
No, that's a good point. I mean, I can provide a context, like I could provide a framework. Like I could, but then again, like how do I know that the framework isn't moving towards me instead of me moving towards it? Well, so here's one answer. I've realized these pieces in VR systems. So if you're wearing goggles, this three-dimensional object is moving and it's in front of you, and you can walk around it and you can stick your head inside of it. So, so the problem's solved.
And in the VR system, you could also move your hands and spin the object.
Yeah,
You had both the
you could grab the object and,
and the opportunity to move
yeah.
the object.
Rick?
Yeah, I'm going to just kind of make a couple observations and then comments on if you want to. So the VR comment, actually, just I'm glad that came up before I start with this first comment, which was watching the last thing and hearing the music. And I just sort of had this sense that, like, the moving images were contained by the screen in a way, and it's like a little bit of the room where music is just, I mean, it's coming out of speakers, but we're kind of experiencing it everywhere. And I kind of had the sense that, like, it was just a huge projection on walls, maybe going all the way around. It would give the images a kind of fighting chance against the music. Of course, that may just be partially
Yep.
the way I'm oriented. But I think like a VR experience would elevate both in a way. So that's just kind of one thing. And then another thing I was thinking about was the still images and knowing the kind of, you know, musical background that you're coming from, composer background, that the still images are sort of like, so the, you know, a piece of music is almost always kind of a continuity over some time frame, right? And still images are snapshots from a process. And I just had the sense that, and I do this a lot, seeing your work like multiple, you know, that is a series, kind of brings out that kind of musical sense more than it's just, well, here's one image from that experiment, and here's that from another one. So just, again, just a couple observations.
No, thanks.
And welcome any comments.
Yeah. These resonances of time in experience of a still thing are terribly interesting. And so this kind of superimposing movement in one image, or having some kind of trace of time, or these arm-drawn systems where the accumulation of a line moving over a long period of time, and we get the sense of the time. We get sense of time from the rotations. Yeah, I thank you for that report, because I experience that too. There's a richness of seeing the rotations, seeing the accumulation, seeing the traces left in time. Yeah.
So I just want to say first, Juan Upar, Orbis Tertius, is one of my favorite Borges stories. I haven't read it in many years, so thank you for and read it again. What I was interested in listening to you talk about your work is my orientation is more towards painting, and I hear in you, in this sort of systems design output or parameter defined output, I hear sort of echoes of, you know, for me it refers to sort of Frank Stella, you know, painting within a defined parameter. But when I also listen to you talk, and some of the sort of references to influences you've discussed, you know, like the dream time and stuff like that, I get a sense there's more there for you when you look at it than you know, like Stella saying, what you see is what you see, and that's it. And so I'm just wondering if you, I guess I'm asking you, is there a ghost in the machine for you in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, this abstract work is concrete. It's not it's not an allegory. It's not it doesn't refer to some figurative thing. It doesn't refer specifically to some specific process in the world. It has this potential to be an analogy to all sorts of systems that we come across and are conditioned by or that we want. But the abstraction is strong for me. I mean, I'm very much influenced by people like Solowet and this idea that the process is kind of the paramount concern. Yeah.
On that note, have you considered displaying the algorithm? Because I do find that kind of curious.
Uh-huh.
You know, the algorithm itself is what's generating all of this.
Yeah.
That's the real work that you produced.
Yeah, I mean, the algorithms have a certain visual appeal too, because I use a graphic programming language where there are a bunch of graphical objects that are cabled together with cables, so you see this kind of spaghetti on the screen in different colors and whatnot. But yeah, but you know, if I were to do a piece in that way, then I would be very careful about how I composed the look of the code also.
The aesthetic.
Yeah.
And just a follow-up question as well. That last object was mapped into a cube, because I didn't see a cube in there at all. I was just kind of
It's so distorted. I guess there's at one point where you kind of see a kind of opening with some corners that, yeah, it's kind of an open cube, like a cube with no top and bottom.
We were watching the last part of it too, right? So
Yeah.
the beginning.
But that's a good example of people looking for a literal explanation. I mean,
Yeah, well,
you said
yeah.
cube, everybody's like,
Where's the cube? Where's the cube?
yeah.
Yep. I should have told you it was a nude. Well, thank you so much.
Thank